Welcome to Wicked Nightmares Horror Stories. These are real events retold as haunting bedtime tales. Let's get into it.
It was late on Halloween night, 1999. The kind of cold, quiet Midwestern night where the streets are empty, the porch lights are still glowing orange, and the last of the candy wrappers are blowing down the road. Across a few small towns, mostly farming communities spread across Illinois and Iowa, local AM radio stations were wrapping up their Halloween specials. Back then, these weren't big operations. Just one or two people in a booth, maybe a volunteer DJ reading ghost stories off paper, playing a few creaky sound effects, and joking with callers before signing off around midnight. Everything about that night felt ordinary until it didn't. At about 11:45 p.m., a handful of listeners across three different towns noticed something strange. Right in the middle of a song, the broadcast suddenly glitched. It wasn't a clean cut. The music seemed to stretch and slow, like someone was dragging a finger across an old tape. Then, the sound dropped into static. For a few seconds, it was just noise, soft hissing, maybe a flicker of the song trying to come back. Most people figured it was a storm or a bad antenna. But then the static started to shape itself into something else. A voice, faint at first, buried in the distortion. Several people later described it the same way. Female, low, and completely flat. No emotion. Like someone reading from a script or talking in their sleep. They're coming. Then again, slightly louder. They're coming. Over and over. The weirdest part? It wasn't coming from one station. People flipping between channels found the same voice, the same words, echoing across multiple frequencies. Three local stations, all miles apart, all hijacked at the exact same time. Listeners started calling the stations, asking what kind of Halloween prank they were running. But in every case, the DJs hadn't done anything. They were just as confused. Some even tried to cut the feed, but couldn't. The voice kept bleeding through, like it had taken over the airwaves completely. After about 90 seconds, the static returned, and then, just like that, everything went back to normal. But in those three towns, anyone who had their radio on that night remembers exactly how it felt. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather, because no one knew who said it or how it got on the air. Back then, most small-town stations still ran on analog transmitters, big metal racks with glowing orange lights, dials, and heavy switches that clicked when you turned them. The kind of setup that hummed when you walked into the room. Digital automation hadn't really taken over yet, so a lot of the work was still done by hand. A DJ would cue up a CD, check the meters, and sometimes patch things manually through cables. These systems weren't perfect. If you lived close enough, and you had the right kind of transmitter, even a homemade one, you could interfere with the signal. Basically, your transmission would overpower the station's frequency for a few seconds. Most of the time, it just caused static or faint music bleeding through from another frequency. It was rare but not impossible. But what made Halloween 1999 so strange was how coordinated it seemed. It didn't happen to just one frequency. It hit three separate AM stations all at once, around 11:45 p.m. Each of those stations was miles apart. One in a small Iowa town near the Mississippi River, another just across the border in Illinois, and a third in a farming community halfway between. About 30 miles of distance between the outermost points. And yet, the same thing happened everywhere. Regular programming stopped. The sound went muffled, like the signal was being smothered. Then came the static. And then, that voice. They're coming, they're coming. The signal was crackly and distorted, but the words were clear enough that anyone listening could make them out. It wasn't fast or panicked. It was measured, like whoever was speaking wanted to be heard. One listener described it later as the voice of someone who already knew something you didn't. For about 90 seconds, every DJ on air lost control. No matter what they did, switching frequencies, cutting to emergency tone, even pulling the feed, nothing worked. The hijacked transmission just kept running. Some of the engineers who were in the control rooms later said their equipment didn't even register the interruption. The meters didn't spike. The transmission logs didn't show any incoming override. The audio had just changed on its own. Meanwhile, Phone lines at all three stations lit up. Listeners calling, asking if it was part of the show. One caller said his radio wasn't even tuned to the same frequency. He was a few notches over and still heard it faintly under the music. Others claimed they heard a second sound behind the voice. Faint thumping, maybe footsteps, or someone breathing through static. One farmer said it sounded like metal scraping concrete. It's worth noting that this wasn't the first time a radio hijack had ever happened. There had been cases before, pranksters interrupting TV or FM signals for a laugh. But those were usually traceable. Someone always got caught. This one was different. The voice cut out suddenly. No fade, no glitch, just gone. Then, without warning, normal programming came back like nothing had happened. The song picked up mid-chorus. The DJ, audibly shaken, fumbled for words. One of them could be heard saying, "Okay, I don't know what that was, folks." Then a nervous laugh. Then silence. Most listeners assumed it was just a Halloween gag. A creepy broadcast stunt, something the stations had coordinated for fun. But within minutes, all three stations started denying it. They hadn't planned anything. There were no special broadcasts, no scripted interruptions. Every engineer who checked the logs said the same thing. There was no record of any signal interference. Nothing unusual in the transmitters. As far as their systems were concerned, nothing had happened at all. But the listeners, hundreds across 3 towns, knew what they'd heard. And in the hours that followed, some of them began to notice something else strange. Police scanners, shortwave radios, even baby monitors within a few miles of those towns, all reportedly picked up faint static bursts that night, just after midnight. A hiss, then silence, then a single phrase, half buried in noise. "They're coming." Within hours, the phone lines at the stations were jammed. Local police departments started getting calls too. People asking if they'd picked up anything strange on their scanners. By early morning, it had gone beyond rumor. The FCC had been notified. For the engineers at those stations, the first theory made sense. It had to be a pirate radio prank. Back then, there were always a few hobbyists experimenting with homemade transmitters. Some were harmless, just trying to reach their neighbors' radios. Others liked to push limits, hijacking local frequencies for a few seconds to shock people. But this one didn't fit that pattern. For one thing, the range was too big. To override 3 licensed AM stations across 3 counties, you need a transmitter powerful enough to draw serious attention, and probably melt your own equipment in the process. And then there was the timing. All 3 broadcasts went down within seconds of each other, not staggered, not fading in or out. It was synchronized. Engineers spent days trying to recreate the interference. They ran diagnostics, checked cables, swapped out transmitters. Everything came back clean. The systems had logged no intrusion. Still, the stories kept spreading. Listeners claimed the voice wasn't just repeating the phrase. Some swore that underneath the words, there were other sounds. Soft at first, then clearer if you turn up the volume. A few said they heard metal scraping, or the echo of footsteps pacing over the static. One truck driver called into a morning show saying it sounded like someone was banging on a door far away from the microphone. Another insisted there were screams in the background, almost too faint to catch. Most people brushed it off. The human brain fills in gaps when it's frightened, especially when you're listening through static. But there were a few who refused to let it go. Several amateur radio operators, the kind who kept shelves full of gear and antennas in their garages, had recorded the broadcast as it happened. Not because they knew it was coming, but because many of them routinely recorded frequencies for signal testing. They shared those tapes with the stations and later with the FCC. The analysis from the radio community was interesting. The modulation pattern, basically the shape of the signal, was wrong. It didn't match any known station's profile. One AM operator said it looked layered, like 2 signals were overlapping but out of sync, creating that eerie distortion effect. A few tried to isolate the voice with editing software. What they found was stranger. Parts of the transmission didn't follow normal amplitude patterns at all. In simple terms, it wasn't behaving like a real human voice run through a microphone. One technician reportedly sent his cleaned-up file to the FCC for deeper review. But after that, the recordings started disappearing. Not officially, No announcement, no confiscations. They just vanished. Links went dead. Tapes misplaced. One operator told a forum years later that the FCC office he'd mailed his copy to claim they'd never received it. Within weeks, talk about the 1999 Halloween signal faded from local news. The stations moved on. The listeners did too. But the engineers who'd been there that night, the ones who heard it live in their headphones, they didn't forget because they checked every machine, every wire, every meter. And there was no trace of any interference. Whatever that broadcast was, it hadn't come through their systems. It had come from inside them. In the days that followed, the story spread quietly through local news. Headlines like Halloween Airwave Hijack Mystifies Tri-County Area appeared in small papers. Nothing sensational, just straightforward reporting. 3 stations disrupted, unknown cause, federal investigation pending. The FCC sent a small team of technicians to review the sites. They drove out in white vans, checked antennas, examined grounding systems, even took notes on the terrain. The official assumption was still that someone nearby had hijacked the signal. But there was a detail that didn't make sense. Each of the 3 stations used different antennas, different relay paths, and even different manufacturers for their transmitters. None shared a power grid or frequency overlap. So how could one pirate signal override all 3? One of the FCC engineers, a veteran technician who'd worked on interference cases before, reportedly said off record that the power required to pull that off would have been way beyond civilian level. In his words, you'd need government-grade equipment or a military relay. But the official report never mentioned that. When the investigation concluded 2 weeks later, the FCC released a short statement. An unauthorized broadcast occurred on multiple frequencies in the Illinois, Iowa region on October 31st, 1999. The source of the interference could not be confirmed. That was it. No follow-up, no updates. The stations moved on, but the people who'd been on duty that night didn't. One of the DJs later said that for weeks afterward, every time he went live, he felt uneasy like something else was listening. A few weeks later, another strange detail surfaced. One of the engineers, curious, checked transmission logs from that night again. Normally, those logs showed a steady stream of voltage readings, second by second. But at exactly 11:45 p.m., the moment the broadcast switched, every station's log showed a perfectly flat line for 90 seconds. No speakers, no static, nothing. It was as if the transmitters had been unplugged from reality for a minute and a half. Around the same time, ham radio operators who'd been scanning other frequencies claimed to have caught fragments of that same phrase, "they're coming." But this time, it wasn't on AM bands. It was coming through shortwave far outside the local range. That discovery reignited speculation. Maybe it hadn't been a pirate at all. Maybe it was a signal bleed, some kind of transmission bouncing off the atmosphere, like a ghost frequency caught in a temperature inversion. It was rare, but scientifically possible. Still, no one could explain the synchronization. 3 stations, 3 different setups, all hijacked in the same 90-second window. Eventually, the media lost interest. The official file was archived, labeled unresolved. But among local radio enthusiasts and engineers, the story became something else, a sort of modern ghost tale. Every October, someone would bring it up again online, asking if anyone had the original recording. A few claimed to, but none of those clips ever matched the real broadcast logs. And by the next Halloween, even those recordings were gone too, vanished from servers. Accounts deleted, almost like the signal wasn't finished yet. Years passed. Most people forgot about the 1999 Halloween broadcast. The stations changed ownership, the DJs moved on, and the old analog transmitters were replaced by digital ones. But a handful of people, mostly engineers, ham operators, and late-night listeners, never really let it go. Around 2007, one of those hobbyists, a retired electronics tech from Davenport, Iowa, claimed he'd found something strange on an old hard drive. It was a folder from his radio logging software dated October 31st, 1999. Inside were bits of audio files, static bursts he used to record automatically during signal drops. He stitched them together, boosted the audio, and shared a short clip online. It was faint, badly degraded, but you could still make out the voice. They're coming. Same tone, same pacing, same cold distance. But this time, there was something new underneath. A low hum, rhythmic, mechanical, almost like an engine idling far away. Some people who analyzed the waveform claimed the hum repeated every 6 seconds with perfect precision, like a coded pulse. A few days after the clip surfaced, the original post vanished. The account that uploaded it was deleted. When other users tried to download cached versions, they got error messages. That pattern would repeat several times over the next few years. Someone would claim to have a clean copy of the 1999 recording. They'd post a snippet, usually late at night, on ham radio forums or old paranormal boards. Then, within hours, it would disappear, not just the post, but the user's entire profile. In 2014, a small radio history blog tried to compile all known mentions of the event. The author tracked down 3 of the original station engineers, now retired. 2 declined to talk. The third agreed to a short phone interview. He said that, at the time, he didn't believe anything paranormal was going on, it was just a technical anomaly. But then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned something he'd never told the FCC. When he'd been cleaning out the control room the morning after the incident, he noticed one of the recording decks, an old reel-to-reel used for air checks, had kept running all night. It had captured the entire 90-second interruption. He said he played it once. The voice was there, clear as ever. But right before the end, something else faded in faint, quick, almost imperceptible. He described it as a sound like whispering right under the static. He said he stopped the tape, rewound it, played it again. And that second time, it wasn't there. He boxed the reel up, sent it to the FCC as part of their request. They confirmed receipt. But when he asked about it later, they told him no such tape existed in their archives. When the interviewer asked him what he thought it all was, he paused for a long time, then said quietly, sometimes I wonder if we were the ones being listened to. After that, he hung up. The blog post went live 2 weeks later. Within days, the site crashed. The author said it was a server issue, but when they rebooted it, that article was gone. And yet, every Halloween since, a few ham radio operators in that same region report the same thing. Just before midnight, a faint burst of static crosses one of the old AM frequencies. Sometimes it's just noise. Sometimes it's nothing. But a few say, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear it. They're coming. Halloween night, 2017. The streets of Silverton, Oregon, had started to wind down. Porch lights were flicking off one by one, and the sound of laughter that had filled the air all evening was now scattered and distant. Just a few last groups of kids running across intersections, clutching their candy before heading home. Emily Nolan stood in her kitchen, half watching the time on the microwave clock, half listening for footsteps on the porch. She wasn't the kind of parent who panicked easily. Silverton was safe, and Jacob had always been responsible. But as the minutes dragged past 9, she started pacing from the window to the door. She sent a quick text, "You almost home?" Then another one 5 minutes later. Both went unread. At first she thought maybe his phone had died. It was an old hand-me-down Nokia she'd given him just in case, but the battery barely held a charge. Still, he should have been back by now. She stepped out onto the porch, listening. The neighborhood was quiet except for the wind moving through the trees. The air had turned colder, sharper, the kind that made every sound travel. She called his name once, softly, then louder. Nothing. By 9:30, she grabbed her keys and got in the car. She started with his usual route, down Maple Avenue, around Pine Street, then toward the park. Her headlights caught the fluttering edges of Halloween decorations still clinging to fences. Fake cobwebs, hanging skeletons, paper ghosts spinning in the breeze. Every now and then she'd slow the car, scanning sidewalks for movement, expecting to see a flash of green from his glow stick. She didn't. At 9:45, she looped around again, driving slower this time. She rolled her window down and called his name. Her voice echoed faintly between houses. The few people she saw were packing up, parents carrying tired kids, porch lights turning off one by one. When she passed the small park near Alder Lane, she pulled over. The swing set creaked slightly in the wind. Candy wrappers were scattered near the bench, and a single orange pumpkin bucket sat tipped over near the curb. She got out and picked it up, thinking for a second it might be his, but it wasn't. This one was cracked on the side and filled with leaves. By the time she got back in the car, it was almost 10. Her stomach tightened. She called his phone again, pressing the phone to her ear, straining to hear anything, a ring, a vibration of voice. It went straight to voicemail. She turned on a Pine Street again, driving slower now, high beams cutting across the yards. On one porch, she saw a skeleton decoration hanging crookedly in the dark. For a split second, her brain tricked her into thinking it was him, standing there motionless. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel. When she got home a few minutes later, she tried to convince herself that he'd just lost track of time. Maybe a friend's parent had offered to drop him off. Maybe he was sitting in someone's living room trading candy. She waited another 15 minutes before calling the police. At 10:15 p.m., Emily dialed 911. Her voice was calm at first, explaining that her son hadn't come home, that he was probably fine, but it had been more than an hour. As she gave the dispatcher his name, description, and costume, her voice started to shake. The dispatcher asked if there was anyone he might have gone with. Emily said no, he'd gone alone. By 10:30, a patrol car pulled up in front of the house, red and blue lights flashing faintly across the pumpkins, still glowing on her porch. The officer asked her to walk him through the night one more time. When she finished, he nodded and said they'd start canvassing the area right away. Emily stood on the porch as the car drove off, the lights fading into the distance. The street was completely still now. Not a single trick-or-treater left, not a sound except the rustling of leaves. She went back inside and sat by the front window, staring out at the empty road, waiting for headlights that never came. That was the last normal moment before the search for Jacob Nolan began. The search for Jacob Nolan began before midnight. By then, the streets of Silverton were completely empty. Porch lights off, candy bowls put away, pumpkins still flickering faintly on porches. The town looked peaceful, but for Emily, every shadow felt wrong. 2 patrol cars started down Maple and Pine, their spotlights cutting through the fog that had begun to settle. Officers walked in pairs, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen a 12-year-old boy in a skeleton costume with a green glow stick around his neck. Most people said no. A few said they'd seen him earlier, hours before, but nothing since. Around 11:30, a sergeant from the Marion County Sheriff's Office arrived to coordinate the search. He ordered a grid sweep of the neighborhood and called an AK-9 team from Salem. Within an hour, the quiet residential blocks were dotted with flashlights, radios, and the occasional bark from the search dog. At 12:12 a.m., the dog picked up a scent on Pine Street, faint but distinct. It led them halfway down the block, right near the intersection with Alder Lane. Then it stopped. The handler walked the dog in circles, trying to reacquire the trail, but it was gone. The scent just ended there, as if Jacob had vanished into thin air. Officers fanned out, checking nearby yards, alleyways, and the wooded strip that ran behind the neighborhood. They found nothing. No shoe prints, no candy, no torn costume fabric, no sign of a struggle. Detectives thought maybe he'd wandered into one of the older houses or gotten into a car with someone he knew. But when they asked Emily if there was anyone Jacob might have trusted enough to accept a ride from, she shook her head. He didn't even know anyone on that side of town. By sunrise, the police had covered every block within a mile radius. Volunteers started showing up, neighbors, friends, even people from nearby towns who had seen the story spreading online overnight. They formed search lines, moving through the parks, ditches, and fields, calling Jacob's name over and over. Reporters showed up by noon. Local news stations set up cameras near the park where he'd last been seen. The town's mayor made a brief statement, calling it a community effort and promising every resource possible to bring Jacob home. By the end of that first full day, more than 200 people had joined the search. By the end of the second, that number had doubled. Still nothing. Then, late on the third night, one of the volunteers, a man named Chris Lowell, made a call to police that would shift the direction of the entire investigation. Chris lived just a few houses away from where the trail had gone cold. He'd been reviewing footage from his home security system mostly to see if his cameras had caught any trick-or-treaters. What he found wasn't clear, but it was enough to make his hands shake as he hit pause. At exactly 8:44 p.m., the same time neighbors reported seeing Jacob near Pine Street. Chris's driveway camera showed a short figure walking along the sidewalk. Small frame, black costume with glowing white lines down the legs and arms, and something bright around the neck. It was Jacob. He was walking calmly, candy bag in hand, looking straight ahead. Then, just as he disappeared out of frame, the camera caught something else. A faint shadow moving in the background. Not a trick of light. Not another kid. Something or someone was standing under a tree across the street. Motionless, half hidden by darkness. The shape never moved closer. It just stood there, watching. Police collected the footage that same night, but when they went back to the scene the next morning, there were no footprints, no tire marks, nothing disturbed in the grass. The spot where the shadow had stood looked completely untouched. And from that point on, the story of a missing boy started to feel like something that didn't make sense, even for a small town used to ordinary explanations. When detectives reviewed Chris Lowell's footage the next morning, they played it again and again, pausing, zooming, adjusting brightness. The timestamp matched exactly with when Jacob was last seen by neighbors. The angle showed the boy walking steadily past, holding his candy bucket in one hand, the green glow stick faintly pulsing with each step. Then, just as he passed out of frame, that same faint figure appeared across the street, barely visible under a tree, still, almost blending into the shadows. No distinct features, just the outline of a person. Investigators tried to enhance the image, but there wasn't much to work with. The footage was low resolution, the camera positioned far back. Even with filters, you couldn't tell whether it was a man or woman, adult or teenager. The only thing clear was that whoever it was hadn't moved for at least 10 seconds. That part of the street didn't have any streetlights. When they visited the spot in daylight, it was just grass, a few trees, and an old telephone pole with faded posters stapled to it. No footprints, no candy, nothing disturbed. At first, police thought maybe it was just another parent, someone waiting for their kids to finish trick-or-treating. But the more they looked at the video, the less sense it made. The shape appeared before Jacob entered the frame and didn't move the entire time he was visible. Then, right after Jacob passed out of view, the figure seemed to fade backward. Not turning, not stepping, just gone. The original footage didn't have sound. But later that afternoon, Chris remembered that one of his other cameras, the one pointed toward his front porch, sometimes picked up ambient audio from the street. He pulled that file and synced the timestamps. What played through the speakers wasn't what anyone expected. At first, you could hear faint voices, laughter, the shuffle of kids walking by. Then Jacob's footsteps, light, rhythmic, and clear on the pavement. But right after he passed, there was another sound layered under the background noise. It wasn't a voice exactly, more like a low, distorted hum. It started faint, rose slightly in pitch, then faded out, a smooth mechanical pattern that lasted only a few seconds. When the audio team at the sheriff's office analyzed it, they couldn't match it to any nearby source. No vehicles, no HVAC units, no power lines. Nothing in that neighborhood should have made a sound like that. They played it for Emily a few days later. She listened quietly, her eyes fixed on the floor. When the hum played, she looked up. "That sound," she said softly. "That's the same sound his phone made when it lost signal." Detectives checked the call logs again. Jacob's phone hadn't pinged a tower since 8:43 p.m., 1 minute before that recording. After that, it was as if it had been powered off or destroyed. The footage was sent to a digital forensics lab for deeper analysis. Weeks passed, and when police followed up, they were told the results were inconclusive. The report never went public. Meanwhile, the town began to quiet down again. Search efforts were reduced, volunteers returned to their routines, and news stations moved on to other stories. But for Emily, every night was the same. She'd leave the porch light on, sometimes until dawn, just in case Jacob somehow found his way back. Then, 6 days after Halloween, just when it seemed like the case had gone cold, Emily's phone rang. The caller ID was blocked. She almost didn't answer. When she finally did, a voice crackled through the line, faint, distant, and almost drowned in static. "Mom!" Then silence, and the call disconnected. The block number call lasted only 7 seconds. Emily stared at her phone, replaying that moment in her head again and again. The voice had been faint, young, shaky, but she was sure it was Jacob. The single word, "Mom," came through, then static, then nothing. She called 911 immediately. Within an hour, officers and tech experts were at her house, pulling call logs, tracing lines, and trying to isolate where the signal came from. But it wasn't easy. Block numbers mask origin data, and if the call was routed through internet or VoIP services, tracking it could take weeks, sometimes months. By midnight, investigators confirmed only one thing. The call didn't come from Jacob's phone. His number was still inactive. His SIM card hadn't connected to any network since the night he vanished. So whoever made that call either used a masked relay app or somehow had access to his voice. Detective Ray Duncan, who had handled missing persons for over 20 years, asked Emily to describe exactly what she heard. She told him the same thing again. It was her son's voice, but quieter, thinner, almost filtered through something. She said there was static, and underneath that, a faint tapping sound like dripping water or footsteps echoing in a hallway. The audio was sent to the state crime lab for enhancement. A week later, they returned a cleaned-up version. When they played it back in the conference room, everyone in the room froze. It did sound like a young boy. You could hear the single word clearly now. "Mom." Then under the static, that same strange, low hum appeared again. The same pattern from the street cameras recording. Only this time, it wasn't faint. It rose sharply, like feedback from a microphone, then cut out in the middle of the word. After that, silence. Detectives requested tower triangulation data for any nearby numbers using masked calling services during that hour. Only one hit came back. A signal that pinged briefly near Route 213, about 2 miles from Silverton, close to an abandoned sawmill that had been shut down since 2003. When officers went out there the next morning, they found the area fenced off, half covered in ivy and moss. The main structure was collapsing inward, with rusted equipment scattered inside. But near one of the side doors, they found something odd. A child's footprint in the dirt, small and clear, like someone had stepped there recently. Next to it, a single candy wrapper, the kind handed out on Halloween. It could have been nothing. A raccoon dragging trash, or an old footprint from a past search. But it lined up eerily close to that ping. Investigators swept the building, checking every corner, basement, and tunnel. They found no signs of life. But in one of the old offices, behind a pile of broken desks, a deputy found a small cracked phone screen. No battery, no SIM card, no casing. Just a shattered display. When they ran the serial number etched on the side, it matched Jacob's phone. Forensics couldn't determine how long it had been there. Maybe days, maybe months. The circuit board was corroded. But one detail stood out. The internal microphone appeared to have been intentionally removed. Emily wasn't told that part right away. Detectives wanted to be sure before they said anything. But word got out through neighbors, volunteers, and eventually reporters. And before long, Silverton's quiet streets turned into rumor central. Some said it was a prank. Others claimed someone had been imitating the boy's voice using online tools. But the timing, the hum, the location, none of it added up. And then, a week later, something new appeared. Early one morning, a mail carrier on Oakwood Lane found a small, unmarked envelope sitting on top of his bag inside the post office. It had no stamp, no sender name, just Emily's address, written in black ink. He handed it to the sheriff's office. Inside was a single photo, grainy, low light, clearly taken at night. It showed what looked like a forest path, maybe near a creek. In the center, illuminated by a faint green glow, was what looked like the shape of a boy wearing a skeleton costume. But his head was turned away, and in the bottom right corner of the photo, written in uneven letters, was one word: home. Detectives traced the photo's paper and ink. It was printed on a cheap home printer using a cartridge that had run out of color halfway through. The location looked like the woods near Silver Creek, about a mile from the sawmill. Search teams went there the same afternoon. They found the spot. Same crooked tree, same bend in the creek. But no sign of Jacob. No footprints. No costume, nothing. The photo was logged as evidence, but a tech analyst noticed something strange when they brightened the image. Behind the boy, just barely visible, was a tall, shadowed figure. Too far to identify, but standing perfectly still. To this day, the sender of that envelope has never been found. Jacob Nolan remains missing. Every Halloween, a few residents in Silverton still report hearing faint tapping near the old sawmill, like a soft knock that echoes once, then fades into the dark. In October of 2014, a family-owned haunted house in rural Ohio became the center of one of the strangest Halloween incidents local police had ever investigated. The place was called the Miller Farm Haunt, a massive red barn on the edge of town, surrounded by cornfields and dirt roads that turned to mud whenever it rained. For years, it was one of those small-town traditions people looked forward to. Kids from neighboring counties would pile into cars, pay a few bucks at the gate, and walk through the barn while friends with fake chainsaws jumped out to scare them. It wasn't fancy, but it worked. The Miller family put heart into it. Fog machines, strobe lights, plywood walls painted with fake blood. Dave Miller, the owner, ran it with his wife and a small group of volunteers, mostly teenagers from the local high school. They'd spend all of October turning the barn into a maze of flickering lights and cheap horror soundtracks. But that year, something about the place felt different. Dave said it started around mid-October. Every night, after closing, once the guests were gone and the lights were off, he'd walk through the barn to make sure nothing was left plugged in. That's when he started noticing things he couldn't explain. He'd hear faint movement from upstairs, slow, deliberate footsteps like someone pacing the floor. Sometimes a door would creak open when no one was there. Other times, a chain hanging from prop display would start swaying on its own. At first, he blamed it on drafts or old wood settling. But the noises got louder as Halloween approached. One night, around 11:30, he stayed late to fix a broken fog machine. He was the only one there. While testing the machine, he heard what sounded like heavy boots walking across the upper floor. They moved from one side of the barn to the other, stopped for a few seconds, then started again. Dave called out, thinking maybe a volunteer had come back for something. No answer. He climbed the creaky stairs, flashlight in hand, but the upper floor was empty. No footprints, no tools out of place. Just a faint smell of dust and paint. When he told his crew about it the next day, they laughed it off. "Man, you've been spending too many nights in there," one of them joked. And Dave agreed, sort of. He wanted to believe it was in his head. But 2 nights later, one of his actors, a girl named Megan, came downstairs pale as a ghost. She said she heard someone whisper her name right behind her while resetting a prop near the stairwell. When she turned around, no one was there. Dave didn't tell her about the footsteps. He just nodded and told her maybe sound was echoing through the rafters. Still, the story spread. By the following weekend, half the volunteers were uneasy being upstairs alone. That's when guests started noticing things, too. On Friday night, October 24th, a couple visiting from Columbus told the ticket booth that one of the screams they'd heard upstairs didn't sound fake. They thought maybe someone had gotten hurt. Another guest, a father who'd brought his 2 kids, said he heard crying, faint, coming from behind one of the walls. But when they finished the tour, everyone was fine. At first, Dave assumed people were just getting into the Halloween spirit. After all, hearing real screams was part of the thrill. But by Halloween weekend, the reports kept coming, all describing the same thing: a female voice screaming or crying from the second floor. The problem was, there wasn't supposed to be anyone up there during show hours. The actors worked the main floor and basement. The second floor had been closed off for years because the floorboards were weak. So Dave checked the security cameras that pointed up the stairwell. Between 9:12 and 9:15 p.m., when guests had been inside, the camera feed glitched. First static, then a few seconds of complete darkness. When the image returned, the motion sensor light upstairs flicked on, as if someone had just walked through. No one on staff was up there. That night, when Dave locked up, he left a voice recorder on the second floor, just to prove to himself it was nothing. The next morning, he played it back in the kitchen while drinking his coffee. For the first few minutes, it was silent except for creaking wood and distant wind. Then, about halfway through, something faint came through the speaker, a soft metallic sound, followed by what might have been breathing. Then, right before the file ended, a whisper so quiet he almost missed it. It said, "They're not gone." Dave didn't tell anyone about the recording. He deleted it, packed up his gear, and told his wife he was done working alone at night. But by then, it was too late. Whatever was happening at Miller Farm had already started. The Miller Farm haunt was packed. The line outside stretched halfway down the dirt road. Cars parked in ditches, kids running around with glow sticks. Inside the barn, the air smelled like hay, fog machine oil, and cheap latex masks. It was chaotic but normal until just after 9. Two high schoolers, a boy and a girl, came sprinting out of the barn straight past the ticket booth. They didn't stop until they were in the parking lot. Both were pale, shaking, and insisting someone had been trapped upstairs. The girl told staff they'd been halfway through the tour when she saw a woman standing in the corridor near the second floor landing. She described her as older, maybe in her 30s, wearing torn clothes, long dark hair hanging in her face. At first, she thought it was part of the show, but the woman wasn't moving. She was just standing there, whispering something over and over, too quiet to understand. The boy said when he took out his phone to take a picture, the woman turned and walked toward a door at the end of the hall. The problem? There wasn't supposed to be a door there. The layout hadn't changed in years. Dave Miller heard the story and thought it had to be a misunderstanding. Maybe one of the actors had wandered off script. He went upstairs with a flashlight, but the entire second floor was empty. The air was colder than it should have been. He checked the wall where the door was supposed to be. Just solid wood paneling. No hinges, no seams. But when he tapped it, it echoed like there was space behind it. Later that night, after everyone left, Dave pulled up the camera feed from the stairwell monitor. Around the exact time the teens said they'd seen the woman, the feed glitched for less than 2 seconds static, a flash of white light, then black. When it came back, the sensor light upstairs flicked on by itself. No figure appeared, but on the audio track, a faint voice could be heard in the background. A whisper. 3 words, "Don't open it." Dave didn't tell the volunteers right away, but word got out. The next day, one of the actors, a guy named Ryan, asked if he could move his station downstairs. He said he didn't feel comfortable being near the stairs anymore every time he stood there. He swore he could hear faint breathing from the top step. By Halloween morning, tension was high. The volunteers joked about the lady upstairs, but no one wanted to be alone in the barn, not even in daylight. When the local paper stopped by to take photos for a holiday feature, Dave almost canceled the event. But tickets had already sold out. Hundreds of people were planning to come. So he convinced himself the voice had to be interference, a glitch in the mic line. That night, Halloween, will be their biggest show yet. It would also be their last. Halloween night, 2014. The Miller Farm haunt opened its doors for the final time at 6 p.m. The sky was clear, the air cold enough for breath to show, and the line outside formed long before sunset. People from nearby towns, Mansfield, Bucyrus, even as far as Columbus, drove out, just to see what all the hype was about. Inside, the volunteers were doing their best to keep up. Ryan, the college student who usually worked the upstairs corridor, stayed near the stairwell this time. He didn't like it up there anymore. The others teased him about it, but quietly, no one else volunteered to go up either. Dave had already decided to keep the second floor sealed. The lady upstairs' story had spooked the staff, and with so many people coming through, he didn't want anyone getting hurt. But around 9:45, that decision got complicated. The generator that powered the fog machines and strobe lights started cutting out. Every few minutes, the lights would flicker, then come back. Dave thought it was the cold air, maybe condensation messing with the circuits, so he went out back to reset it. While he was gone, Ryan noticed something strange. From the base of the stairwell, he could see a faint light flickering up top. The second floor was supposed to be dark, locked off, but the glow pulsed every few seconds, dim, yellow, like a candle or a phone flashlight. He called out, thinking maybe a guest had wandered where they shouldn't. No answer. Then, over the noise of the sound effects and chainsaws, he heard it. A woman's voice, faint but distinct. Not screaming, not whispering this time. Just speaking, softly. It sounded like she was saying a name. He thought maybe one of the volunteers was pranking him. So, Against his better judgment, he started up the stairs. The boards creaked under his boots, dust drifting through the fog. The closer he got to the top, the clearer the sound became, slow, rhythmic words. He couldn't tell what they were, but they repeated in the same low tone. He reached the landing, shined his flashlight around. The light bounced off cobwebs, stacks of old lumber, a row of broken props. The air was cold and still. Then he saw it, a faint outline near the far corner like someone standing in shadow. The same spot where the teens had claimed they'd seen a woman 2 nights before. "Hey," he called out. "This area is closed." No response. He stepped closer, one hand gripping the rail. The light flickered again, then went out. Downstairs, guests in the maze heard a loud thud. It wasn't part of the show. Someone screamed, and the lights cut off completely. The generator outside had gone down again, but this time it didn't come back on. Inside, total darkness. For 30 seconds, no one moved. A few guests thought it was a special blackout effect. They laughed, waiting for the next strobe or sound cue. But then another scream echoed sharper, panicked. Someone yelled for help. Dave ran in from outside, flashlight in hand, shouting for everyone to exit through the emergency door. The crowd moved fast, tripping over props and fake tombstones. Within minutes, the barn was empty except for the staff. And Ryan was gone. At first, they assumed he'd gotten out with the guests. But when everyone regrouped outside, he wasn't there. His prop chainsaw lay near the stairwell, its plastic blade cracked in half. His mask, a cheap skeleton half-face, was still on the floor. They searched every corner of the barn, yelling his name. Nothing. The attic door at the top of the stairs was shut tight, sealed with a padlock that hadn't been touched in years. Still, when Dave went to grab the handle, he noticed deep scratches on the wood, fresh ones cutting straight through the paint. When police arrived an hour later, the first thing they did was clear the building. They found no sign of forced entry, no footprints in the dust, no evidence anyone else had been inside. But they did find something behind one of the fake walls near the stairwell, a space about 3 feet wide, hidden behind plywood. Inside that hollow, there were old boards, a broken chair, and what looked like dried wax pooled on the floor. One officer said it looked like someone had been lighting candles there recently. The sheriff ordered a full search of the property. Deputies combed the fields, the corn rows, even the creek behind the barn. They found tire tracks near the edge of the property, but they couldn't tell if they were from visitors or something else. By sunrise, the only thing missing was Ryan. Dave gave his statement around 6 a.m., sitting in the back of a patrol car, hands shaking from exhaustion. He told them everything about the woman the guests saw, the voice recording, the upstairs noises, even a whisper on the security feed. The detective wrote it all down, but he didn't look convinced. Then, one of the techs came over with a clipboard. He said the generator failure had been caused by a wiring surge, something that shouldn't have happened. The surge started in the attic that was locked from the outside. When they checked the security DVR, the attic camera had activated for the first time in years. The system time-stamped it at 9:46 p.m. right when the blackout started. The footage was only 12 seconds long. Static, flickering lights, and at the very end, just before the feed cut out, a dark shape crossed the frame. It looked human, but it wasn't walking. It was crawling. The morning after Halloween, the Miller Farm property looked more like a crime scene than a holiday attraction. Yellow tape stretched across the barn doors. Police cars lined the dirt road, and the last of the fog machines sat silent in the cold air, still leaking wisps of vapor that caught the sunrise. Detectives from the county sheriff's office arrived early. They'd handled missing person cases before, but not like this. One of the first things they did was ask Dave to unlock the attic door, the one no one had opened in years. He hesitated. The padlock was old and rusted, but intact. He hadn't touched it since before the haunt opened for the season. When they finally cut it, the hinges gave a dry, metallic groan that echoed down the stairwell. Inside, the attic smelled like dust and wood rot. It was bigger than anyone remembered, full of old props and forgotten decorations, broken mannequins, deflated inflatables, crates of tangled lights. Dust covered everything, but something didn't fit. Near the center of the room was a circular patch of clean floor, about 6 feet wide, as if someone had recently cleared it. Around the edge of that circle were dark stains, maybe wax, maybe something else, and small bits of burnt string. A detective crouched and picked up one of the pieces. It looked like a wick from a candle. There were no footprints in the dust, except for a single boot print near the far wall. Ryan sighs. They followed it to the corner, where a narrow space between the rafters led to a crawl tunnel one that hadn't been on any of the original blueprints. It looked hand-dug, the kind of thing someone might have carved out years ago for wiring or storage. But it stretched deeper than expected, angling down into the barn's wall cavity. A search team used a small camera probe to check inside. The tunnel went about 15 feet down, ending in a pocket of dirt and broken boards. They didn't find Ryan, but the camera picked up something strange, several small pieces of fabric stuck between the boards. When they pulled them out, the material matched the torn sleeve from his costume. Back at the sheriff's office, investigators reviewed the attic camera footage again. It was low quality and distorted, but one frame caught their attention. Just before the feed cut out, something flashed against the lens, a quick, bright reflection, like light bouncing off metal. The text enhanced the image, frame by frame. It wasn't metal. It was a human eye. The angle didn't make sense. It was too close to the lens, as if someone had crawled right up to the camera and stared into it upside down. When they checked the timestamp, it was 9:46 and 27 seconds p.m., the exact second the blackout started and Ryan vanished. News of the disappearance spread fast. Local reporters showed up, neighbors brought food for the Millers, and within days, amateur ghost hunters started sneaking onto the property. Everyone had a theory that Ryan ran away, that someone kidnapped him, or that the woman upstairs had been real all along. Dave, though, just wanted answers. He shut down the attraction for good, boarded the barn, and told police they could keep all the footage and recordings. He didn't want any of it back. But the case never went anywhere. The footage was inconclusive. The crawl space led to nothing, and Ryan's phone, wallet, and car keys were all still in his locker. No activity on his accounts, no new leads. 2 weeks later, the sheriff's office closed the official investigation, labeling it an unresolved missing person. For a while, life in town went back to normal until December, when Dave returned to the property one last time to collect equipment he'd left behind. It was early morning. The ground was frozen, the barn silent. But when he unlocked the side door, the motion sensor light flicked on upstairs. He stood at the bottom of the stairwell, staring up. Then, from somewhere in the dark, he heard it again, that faint voice. This time clear, a whisper drifting down through the rafters. "Don't open it." After that morning, Dave Miller didn't go back to the barn again. He locked the doors, nailed plywood across the entrances, and handed the keys to the county. He told his wife, if they want to tear it down, let them. "I'm done." But the county didn't tear it down. The Millers owned the land outright, and without a clear criminal case, the property just sat there untouched. By spring, the weeds grew waist-high, the paint peeled from the barn sides, and the once famous Miller Farm Haunt sign hung crooked, one chain broken. Still, people came. First, it was a few teens with flashlights, sneaking in at night to film TikToks. Then it was amateur investigators with EVP recorders, hoping to capture the scream. And eventually, a few local journalists tried to do follow-up pieces, all of them leaving with stories that didn't make sense. One reporter claimed his camera shut off the moment he reached the second floor. Another swore he saw light moving through the attic window, like someone walking past with a lantern, even though the electricity had been cut for months. But the strangest detail came from the sheriff's department. In 2016, almost 2 years after Ryan disappeared, a new deputy was cataloging old evidence from the case. When she plugged in one of the original security hard drives to verify the files, it started glitching. Frames from the attic feed flickered across her monitor, looping, freezing, then distorting until one frame froze completely. It wasn't the same image police had seen before. This time, the camera showed the attic perfectly still, lit by natural daylight. A man stood in the middle of the frame pale, motionless, wearing the same dark jeans and work shirt Ryan had worn that night. He was facing the camera. But here's what made it impossible: the date stamp. It read October 29th, 2016, 2 years after he vanished. The techs tore apart the drive, thinking it was a glitch or a hoax. But there was no sign of file tampering. The drive had been locked in an evidence cabinet since the week after the disappearance. They sent the image to the FBI's Digital Forensics Unit. The official conclusion? Unverifiable artifact. Unofficially, one of the analysts told a reporter off the record that the image looked too clean to be an error. After that, the county sealed the file. Today, the Miller farm still stands, though it's fenced off and posted with no trespassing signs. The boards over the doors are newer, heavier, nailed in from the inside. Locals say on cold nights, if you drive down County Road 12 and turn off your headlights, you can see the faint glow of orange coming from the second floor window of the same room where the real scream was first heard. Some say it's just light reflecting from passing cars. Others swear it's the old fog machine, still somehow running after all these years. And a few, mostly the ones who worked there that Halloween, say it's Ryan, still trapped in the attic, still staring into the camera, waiting for someone to open the door again.
That was another real bedtime story from Wicked Nightmares Horror Stories. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.